Our childhood experiences play a powerful role in shaping who we become. The way we are treated, the things we learn, and even the challenges we face early on can leave a lasting mark on our mindset, attitudes, beliefs, and relationships as adults. Whether it's the encouragement from a caring teacher, the support of family, or lessons learned from tough moments, these memories and experiences become the foundation for how we see the world, how we handle challenges, and how we relate to others. In many ways, our past quietly guides our choices and reactions. Understanding this connection can help us grow, adapt, and make positive changes in our lives moving forward. Hey there, Truth Seeker. Welcome to the Star Kittens community where we discuss 13 sign astrology. Are you in alignment with your divine design? Do you want to master the metaphysical reality? Open the doors of perception. Each planetary body is an archetype, a template, if you will, that helps us interpret human behavior and the world around us. The more awake and aware we are, the more synchronicity will show up in your life. Our focus today is the Libra new moon, the grand trine with Vulcanus, and T-square with asteroid Lilith. Opposite Uranus forms a tight conjunction with Sedna. To help us reach more souls with this important message, please like, share, and subscribe. There is a lot going on, so let's jump in. Kia ora, David.
Kia ora.
We're doing it a bit different today. See if we enjoy this format more. We are sitting around the same table and we're going to talk about this beautiful new moon coming up. But first, it is your birthday month and you lived for many years thinking that your sun was in Scorpio. So how did you make that fit?
Yeah, I came to astrology as a process, well, it was a process of self-discovery. When I was first introduced to it is in the days of no internet, no, computer programs, software apps, that sort of thing. So, I would have been maybe 11 or 12. And I was trying to make sense of what was quite a difficult childhood in terms of born in South Africa in 66, and between 66 and 76, I think as the oldest of three boys, our family went through a fair bit of turmoil in terms of moving from South Africa to New Zealand, and then in New Zealand we moved multiple times, so I had various schools. This isn't an experience which is uncommon to people, but at the time, as I began to think about what the impacts were that it was having on me, I turned to astrology. And of course, in those days, as I said, without the internet, without ChatGPT or any of these other tools that we have today, all we had was books. So I would go to the library and read and read and read. And in those days also you had to cast your own charts, like it was a mathematical formula of working out where all the planets were. And so obviously the 12 sign system was what I was engaging with. And that was, the best part of 40 years ago. So I'm showing my age now, closing in on my I've just had my second Saturn return. So close to 60. So for the last 40 years, I've been studying astrology quite closely. And so from about 11 or 12, I was immersed in the idea of 12 sign astrology. And of course, I cast my own chart using, in those days, what was called an ephemeris. So those who are familiar with ephemeris would know that that's a very statistically or mathematical book that shows you exact placement of planets years in advance and in the past as well. And so I plotted all of this and found out, according to the 12 sign system, that I was a Scorpio. And for many years, in fact, for maybe 25 to 30 years, I believed genuinely that I was a Scorpio, and that was based on the fact that Scorpio under the 12 sign system has 30 degrees, and my birthday falling on the 14th of November meant that I was right smack bang pretty much in the middle of the Scorpio. And, you know, it kind of made sense. Lots of the times when I was applying what I was learning, see, astrology for me was like a way to learn psychology without going to college to learn psychology. So it's come to me to be a way of understanding human behavior. And so I was using myself as a guinea pig and, you know, looking at the concepts and the ideas from famous astrologers. In fact, some of these books that were written back in those days, and we're talking, you know, 77, 78 when I was first exposed to this, yeah, there was some very profound writing about astrology that was found in the libraries. And it was incredibly engaging for my curious mind of understanding how psychology worked in terms of the overlays. So Saturn had a role, and Mars had a role, and Venus had a role, and so on and so forth. But to cut a long story short, it wasn't until I discovered 13 sign astrology, which was maybe 6-7 years ago, that I realized that I wasn't in fact a Scorpio, I was a Libra. And it was like the feeling that I had was one of initially profound release and awareness, like I've just discovered something about, firstly, my learning process of the last 30 years at that stage had been flawed. I mean, I genuinely believed that it was the real deal, like 12 sign. I was totally immersed in it. I was doing readings. I was applying it to my own life in many, many ways, and I found it to be incredibly powerful as a tool of self-discovery. But it never quite fitted. Scorpio and all the descriptions of Scorpio and so on didn't really make sense to me. But when I discovered 13 sign and I realized that the sun actually doesn't spend 30 days in the constellation of Scorpio, that it only spent 7 days in the constellation of Scorpio, so therefore I was a Libra, it felt like I'd finally found a piece of a self-discovery puzzle, both spiritually, emotionally, and mentally, that unlocked an incredible amount of, what shall I say, aha moments. It was like my brain just connected a whole bunch of dots. So it felt like I had jumped a timeline, I feel like. It felt like I had made a massive quantum leap. And as a consequence of changing my mindset and it felt like I was putting on the right, a well-fitted suit or well-designed clothes. It was like that, where it was just the perfect fit. And ever since then, I've realized that there are parts of 12 sign astrology that still apply in 13 sign, especially with the bigger planets like Saturn, Neptune, Pluto, which move more slowly. And there's a lot of crossover. So I haven't thrown out the baby with the bathwater. But you're right that this is a Libra experience for me now, and I felt like I've come home to my soul family. Yeah.
Yeah, and now I do have that Scorpio energy in me because of my ascending sign. And it's interesting how those energies are still very much part of our lives. And, you know, I've had many conversations with people who are just, they can't comprehend, like, they can't be lying to us. No, there's no way that 99% of astrologers are using a system that's incorrect. And, you know, you just have to pull up an app, which I do on a weekly basis, and I can clearly show people. I mean, I typed into Google this week, how many days does the sun spend in the constellation of Scorpio? And it comes back with 7 days. roughly from the 23rd of November until the 29th of November. So this new moon is on the 20th of November, so still very much in Libra. And on the chart, the new moon, we have a beautiful conjunction of not only the sun and the moon, but also Mercury. They're all sitting at 20 degrees Libra. So we spoke in the car a little bit about this Mercury energy, and very much the person that we are as an adult is very founded in how our upbringing was. So what would you like to share about that energy at this new moon?
Yeah, I mean, the first thing that struck me about that, the sun, the moon, and Mercury all lined up together, is that, and they're very close. I think they're all at 20 degrees, aren't they? Yeah. So the energies of Mercury is very strong here at this new moon. And Mercury, the way that I describe that energy is that it's related to the third house, and it's related to the house of learning, how we learned. And we were reflecting on your kids and realizing that, what we see with one of them, by the time we're 10, we have learnt and have developed attitudes and mindsets towards the world. You see, in traditional astrology, that Gemini or Mercury energy is related to siblings and the learning processes. I mean, a lot of people refer to Mercury as communication, but communication, if we take a step back, is based on what we've learned. You can only communicate what you've learned, what's in your consciousness or subconsciousness.
And it's not just what we say, so it's not just whether you learn a language at a young age, a second language, but it is also observing how do the adults in my life, how do they communicate, both verbally and non-verbally? Do they stand tall and show? Here in New Zealand, we have the te reo word is mana. You stand there with pride, with look at me, I am worth something. So it's that whole combination of what do you observe as you grow up from day dot up until about 10, I guess. That's where it really sits in stone. How do I deal with people? How do I deal with conflict? Am I a talker or am I a hitter when things don't go my way? So yes.
Yeah, look, and those behaviors, those characteristics get developed very early on, and there's always this argument when you're dealing with when you really dive into Mercury energy and how it influences any planets that it comes into alignment with. We've got to go back to those early experiences and the immersion that we had in the learning process. Now, that has varied over the generations. I think it's important to understand that, as a kid growing up, for me, 60s and 70s, as I mentioned in the outset, I wasn't exposed to the digital world, this the way that, say, your kids are, or even you as a millennial. And so the learning process, the wiring of the brain, and therefore the ability to communicate ideas, assimilate ideas, form concepts, are different for each generation. And I believe that learning through reading, for example, as opposed to learning from listening to a podcast, which is valid, obviously, or watching a YouTube video, which wasn't available for me as a child. There are different processes that we interpret that information. And so I, as a kid, was immersed in learning by reading and by turning the pages on a book and that sort of thing. So when we look at that in terms of a new moon experience in Libra, where Libra is about balance, and Libra refers to the scales. And so we're talking about Libra air and Mercury air. We're talking about balance within the way we think, balance within the way we see the world, which ultimately, though, comes back to how we learned to see the world. And like you say, how the siblings that we rub shoulders with, the teachers that influenced us, the great auntie or the great aunt, the uncle, the kids next door. There are so many sources of data, if you like, Mercury data that come to us as kids that now reflect as adults. And when we're talking about a Libra new moon conjunct Mercury, we're talking very much about our mindset. We're talking very much about our beliefs. We're talking very much about our ability to communicate. And when I overlay the Libra piece there in terms of balance, what comes to me immediately is to ask the question with a Mercury conjunct new moon in Libra is, where am I imbalanced? Where in my communication or my mindset have I tilted too far to one side? Where do I have blind spots? Where am I not seeing what I need to see? Where is it that I might be stuck in my communication? Make no mistake that when you have Libra air and Mercury air, that this is about our mental processes. This is about how we think. This is about how we see the world and how we communicate what it is that we see. And also about how we defend our beliefs. And when we think about Libra and the scales, are we defending a position? Are we having a conversation about 12 sign astrology? And there are people who will absolutely defend that position. And there are people who will talk about 13 sign astrology as an alternative. Perhaps there's a balance between the 12 and the 13 sign system, for example, would be, in this context, something that would come to mind based on this conversation.
Yes. And because it's the new moon, so the sun and moon together, so the sun energy would then just amplify all this?
Absolutely. And we're talking, in the lunar cycles about this is the beginning of a cycle. It's a reset. It's an activation. It's where we set forth, we set sail. Often it's calm, but if we think of the analogy of we're starting a journey for 28 days, but of course, if we're beginning something else is drawing to a close. And so for me, new moon energies is as much about looking forward, particularly in the short term, say for the next 28 days, and then breaking that into those 7-day cycles between the new moon and the first quarter moon is a key cycle, especially if you're planning. And when we're thinking about air energy and mental energy, this is very much an energy of planning, of thinking about, okay, what are the steps I'm going to take to tangibly set a goal and reach those goals? And then those little milestones that we can have of 7 days, which is the quarter moon, 14 days, which is the full moon. Of course, the next quarter moon is that 21st day, and then it concludes at the 28th day. So there's an aspect of timing when it comes to Mercury, and that timing is very clear here because we are starting a new moon cycle, but it's in Libra, and the idea of balance, I just keep coming back to that word of finding equilibrium. Don't tilt too far in one direction and be open to experiences as well. But it's difficult to do if we are carrying, as I said, we all have biases, we all have blind spots. And that's the thing to be aware of when we're setting a goal and we're setting plans. And when we're communicating any ideas, when we're having a conversation with our friends, our family, our lovers, our workmates, our boss, perhaps one of the things to reflect on at this new moon as a project is to reflect on your own conversation, and maybe, like we're doing here, listen to yourself. I mean, that's a really powerful piece of feedback, is to talk into your phone and then listen to yourself and reflect back as to your tone and your words and your language, or write things down would be another way of reflecting. So all of those energies come into play at this new moon.
That's awesome. Thank you. So we just spoke about the conjunction of Mercury, the Sun, and the Moon at 20 degrees Libra. And this time we are seeing two beautiful geometric shapes. One is the T-square, so that's a nice opposition between the Sun, Moon, Mercury. On the other side is Uranus and Sedna sitting in Taurus, and making this degree, this top of the triangle, is with asteroid Lilith sitting in Capricorn. So just for those who haven't heard us before, we use the actual physical asteroid of Lilith in our charts. It's not an imaginary point. And I think it's really important that to let people know that we use a physical object, because it is resonating a particular energy, and this time it's sitting in Capricorn. So how do you see this triple relationship? And we're dealing with Mercury 1, Sun 2, Moon 3, Uranus 4, Sedna 5, and then Lilith being the sixth energy in this tension type relationship. How does that play?
Yeah, there's a lot going on there. So let's look at it piece by piece. The Uranus energy directly opposite represents disruption, sudden shocking events. So in the context of what we've been talking about, which is our mindset and our mental processes, our ideas, our belief structures, coming from the Mercury conjunct Moon and Sun in Libra, and the idea of balance. The role here of the Uranus energy is to awaken us to new perspectives, to awaken us to new ideas. And that can happen. There's no set formula for how that awakening can take place. It's expressed as a potential in the cosmic rhythm. The timing of that for each of us individually is unknown and uncertain. And that's the idea of lightning striking. Even on a clear day, lightning can come out of nowhere. So the Uranus energy is very much about both, I like the expression, break down or break through. An awakening can come through a series of events which blow up in your face, which cause you to question something about your beliefs. They could come through your work, they could come through a relationship, they could come through a number of channels, if you like. But the most likely way for that disruption or that shaking up experience to arrive when we're thinking about Libra is via relationships. And we've talked before about Libra relationships as defined by, there's a serious element to Libra's relationships, and there is what we like to call contracts or commitments. So Libra relationships involve contracts or commitments to separate them from those family relationships, to separate them from friendships. Typically, a Libra relationship would be one in which you have entered into some kind of serious agreement with another. And that might be formally through a marriage, or it could be informally just through a really solid, strong relationship. But there's another aspect to these Libra relationships that involve contracts and commitments, and of course that's professional relationships. So the reason I mention those two from a relationship perspective is that the shaking up of our ideas, the shaking up of our mindset that could be triggered by a Uranian experience would be most likely to happen in the context of one of those types of relationships. So something shocking happens with your partner or at work, for example, where there is a strong relationship with an employer. So that's the Uranian energy. Of course, Uranus is conjunct Sedna as well. And that confirms for me that Sedna, this is all happening in Taurus, that there will be another aspect of this awakening experience to our mindset, which relates to how we manage resources. And Sedna, when we look at the myth of Sedna, we're talking very much about the water and our relationship with the marine ecosystem and the goodies that come from the water, and so we have earth and water and air and fire. So water is a very important, and that Sedna energy, even though it's in an earth sign of Taurus, we're very much focused on the waters of life. And so we're talking about, you know, I think in a previous podcast we laid out that Sedna myth was very much to do with the marine life, with fishing, with there's a massive ecosystem that exists, including with the carbon dioxide cycle that exists on this planet, that we wouldn't be able to survive without water. And so not only is there a potential awakening when you talk about the Uranian energy in the context of this Libra full moon within relationships, but there's also an awakening that could come in terms of the way we see and manage the resources of water, which is the Sedna energy. Now, of course, any of this could happen or might not happen. That's the whole wild card nature of Uranus, is that there's no way of understanding. It's what economists call a black swan event. It just comes out of nowhere, right? Equally, nothing may happen. So it's just about being aware that there is potential for things to unravel, and then our mindset towards that unraveling could be both a positive and a negative. We could have a positive experience, an affirming experience of something breaking down, that classic expression of one door closes, another opens. Or sometimes you have to go through a rough and difficult experience within a relationship, say, to see something you didn't see previously. So we've got all of those things playing out, and there's a tension. There's always a tension when you have an opposition, and there certainly is a tension that exists here. But what's adding to that is, as you mentioned, is this third piece, this grand, or this cross, the square energy that has Lilith at the top. And Lilith is a difficult archetype because it involves so many different aspects. But again, it comes back to mindset. When we look at Lilith from mythology, Lilith is related to the first woman, what many call the mitochondrial Eve. And that conjures up in the memory the idea of Adam and Eve. Adam being supposedly the first man and Lilith or Eve being the first woman. And I interchange Eve and Lilith here because, like many of these archetypes, they're talking about the same character. Both in history and mythology, Lilith is related to the first woman, so the feminine energy. But the reason that Lilith is so difficult to interpret often in astrology readings, especially in the idea of, we've started with, this is about our mindset and our attitudes and our beliefs, Mercury, Moon, and Libra. And I touched before about how we may be tilting one way or the other. If you think about people's ideas, if you just asked 10 people, what is your idea or concept of Eve? Many of them would draw upon a story that they heard from the Bible, which firstly was that Eve, or Lilith, was fashioned from the rib of Adam, and Eve was also responsible for eating of the apple from the tree of life, and that was the first sin, quote unquote. So they're pretty strong ideas that may be shaken up at this new moon because of that Uranian energy. But ultimately, Lilith is about finding our truth, our inner truth. There's another aspect to that Lilith-Eve story, which is that she believed that she was being subjugated by the male and left Adam to find her feet, to find her own way. So we not only have a story of Eve, which is potentially quite distorted, being the mother of sin. And in many religions, that's seen as a really bad thing. So she's seen in a terrible light. And this is a classic Libra structure here, where you've got this very dark image of Eve, Lilith on the one side, but you've also got a very light and positive image of Lilith on the other, which is to do with breaking free of subjugation, especially within the context of a relationship. If Eve was to find her inner truth, what we call her divine design, then she needed to be away from Adam. And one of the stories of that relationship is that Eve was subordinate to and subjugated by Adam, so therefore he was above her. And that, again, is an idea that in many relationships exists, whereas another perspective from Libra and a Uranian perspective of that may be we are equals. We're not, there's no power struggle here. There's no you're better than me or I'm better than you. We're both equals and we're moving forward together. So we have a number of different energies in play here. And they're all quite diverse and different, but depending on who's listening and what resonates, there may be pieces that you pick up and take away, and other pieces that you leave behind.
Thank you. So just to kind of separate, so the other geometric shape that we're dealing with today is a trine. So it's favorable energy. So just to go back to this T-square, we have the conjunction, then the opposition, and a square on both sides. So if just to give us a better understanding, how is that more of a negative? Why is it because we are being pulled in both directions, this tension relationship between these planetary bodies?
Yeah, I mean, look, a T-square where there's more than one square involved, so there's 3 sets of squares, simply means that the pressure is ramped up, would be the simplest way to look at it. Whereas a square has tension in it. If we have, any of us have a square relationships, and we all have them in our personal charts, or from a collective perspective, there's a square relationship. The collective is under pressure to act upon that. The square is the cosmos saying you need to deal with this. You need to confront it. You need to act upon something. Because in the experience of first understanding what the blocks or the impediments are, then you will realize that there's, on the other side of that, when you break through that there's freedom, that there's expansion, that there's release. So a square is the precursor of breakthrough. It's the precursor of release. Whereas a trine, what we were talking about before, is a free-flowing energy. So the simplest way to look at it in my mind is headwinds and tailwinds. You know, a square is a headwind. Doesn't mean that you can't function. If you're driving your car, you can still drive in a headwind, but it's a lot easier to drive with a tailwind. You talk to a pilot, it's much easier to fly with a tailwind than it is to fly into a headwind. So there are different skills required to navigate and negotiate, but the wind still exists. And I think the wind is a fair piece of this analogy, because we're talking about the air signs of Libra and Mercury. So if we take that a little further, the square is you're battling into the wind, so you just got to keep going, and that requires us to dig into our resolve, into our resilience, into our reserves, if you like, and persistence. Whereas a trine is pushing us forward, and it's almost like, provided you're heading in the right direction, you're going to land on your feet with a trine.
Yeah, and I like what you said. It's like it's confrontational. The universe is kind of confronting a subject. It's like, look at this. It's time for you to perhaps think differently about this. The Mercury way of doing it might not be serving you well in the future. So maybe change your mind or see how we can do it differently. And the tailwind might come if you are changing that way. So the trines that we're talking about today, so the Sun Moon making a trine to one side with Vulcanus, who's still sitting in Cancer, and then also with Neptune in its home sign of Pisces. So tailwind, positive energy, you'll land on your feet. Neptune we see as the sacred masculine energy sitting in its home sign. Cancer, another water sign. So how would you like to interpret those different energies today?
Yeah, we've talked before about Vulcanus and the story of he was the black sheep in his family. He was the ugly duckling. He was born into the mythology about Vulcan is an interesting one because he was born into a royal bloodline and rejected by his mother because he was considered to be, as I said, the ugly son. And so he was cast out and had to literally forge his own way in the world. And that led to him experiencing something of a Lilith experience in terms of he had to make, he had to step away from this patriarchal dominant, in this case it was a mother, to find who he was in the world. And it, without going too deep into the story, because it's a long and involved story, but effectively it's about how a male deals with estrangement from his mother. It's very specifically about that. When we look at the Sedna story, and there's a lot of these stories which deal with females' estrangement from the father. So Sedna is one of those. There's another one of those when we talk about Ceres or Persephone, same sort of thing, where there's an estrangement or a schism, if you like, between the parent and the child. Well, this Vulcanus schism is very much to do with the male falling out with his mother and the consequences of that. And the Vulcanus in Cancer is such an interesting place for Vulcan to be, because when we talk about the estrangement from the mother, of course, Cancer is very much related, not always, but can be and tends to be related to the mother energy. And I say that sometimes it's not, because when we look at the position of Cancer in the chart opposite Capricorn, and you're looking at that 410 relationship, then that relationship or our ideas, and this is where we come back to with Mercury, right? We go back to childhood. Our ideas of our relationship with our parents are formed in the home. So if you're a young man and the mum was, say, out working all day, then the relationship with the father may in fact have been the primary relationship. The father may have been the nurturer. The father may have taken the role of being the caregiver. So I always say with caution that Cancer always relates to the mother. Usually it does, but not always, because it depends on the way that that child was reared in that particular family setting. But for this specific interpretation, Vulcan relates to an estrangement with the mother. So this young boy's cast out, and he is angry about that. And he boils with this, he's seething with this idea that he wasn't good enough for his family. So, of course, what that leads to is Vulcan trying to prove himself as being worthy of his mother's love. And as the story goes, Vulcan was then came across his mother again later in life. And he, at this stage, as a young man, had become a very skilled craftsman. He was very adept in jewelry. He made incredible pieces that people coveted. And one of the pieces that he made was for a mermaid figure who was wearing this beautiful pearl necklace or whatever it was, this bling in our modern parlance. And his mother saw this and thought, that's there was an amazing piece of work and she wanted it for herself. And so she approached this young lady who had obtained this from Vulcan. And of course the mother says to her, where did you get that? And she said it was from Vulcan, but she didn't know that Vulcan was her son and so on. And so the dots got joined, and all of a sudden there was this attempt at reconciliation between Vulcan, who had been estranged from his mother. And the reconciliation didn't go particularly well because there was all these unresolved issues. And what that speaks to in the context of relationships is that these unresolved issues permeate into the way we conduct ourselves in relationships as adults. So a young man who was estranged from his family, and it's a common story, and we can talk also about, we touched on it before, about Sedna was estranged from her father. You know, the Sedna story, which I didn't mention, but he forced her into a marriage and she fought against that. So we have an estranged female archetype from the masculine father figure, and we have an estranged masculine archetype from the mother figure. So we have very interesting energies playing out with Sedna and Vulcan here, all in the base against the concept of this Libra energy of relationships. So if we think about that a little further and we think, okay, if you are in a relationship, or you are a young man or an older man in a relationship and you had a difficult childhood relationship with your mother, there will be aspects of the way you are dealing with the world that reflect that. And the Uranus energy here is saying it's time maybe to look at that, to revisit it, and to shake it up because it might not be serving you any longer. So that's the Vulcan energy. It is in and of itself, because Vulcan's sitting in Cancer, what we also know is that it's emotional. So we're talking about deep emotions that could explode to the surface given the right set of triggers in the context of a Libra relationship. So you get triggered, you're a male, you might have a female boss, you start playing out all sorts of unresolved issues that actually go back to your childhood, and suddenly the relationship with your boss, a serious committed Libra relationship, turns pear-shaped. Or you're a male in a relationship with your female partner, and there's some things begin to play out and some dynamics begin to play out, and they just don't, and they explode. They literally explode. Vulcan relates to underwater volcanoes when we're talking about Cancer. So there's the risk of that absolutely in your face emotional experience coming to the surface at this new moon. And then, of course, on the other side there, we've got this. What do we have?
The Neptune.
Neptune. The Neptune one is interesting too, because if we look at the two sides of Neptune, you've got the shadow side of Neptune, which is avoidance, delusion. I mean, we often joke with each other about you spend so much time in denial, you know, the river Nile denial, that you can't, you know, the expression you can't see the wood for the trees, right? So the shadow side of Neptune is avoidance. It's a tendency to push things away, to say, I don't want to deal with that. So if we layer in, okay, we're talking Gemini, so childhood, so there could be some stuff from childhood that you're not willing to tackle. When we layer in Sedna and Vulcanus, there could be stuff within the relationship with your mother or your father that you are unwilling to tackle. And that Neptune energy can be fuzzy and hazy and kind of mystical, and this is what often leads to addictive behaviors. The Neptune archetype is often associated with, I can't cope and so I turn to drink. I can't cope so I turn to drugs. I can't cope so I turn to, you know, binge watching, binge eating, whatever it is, avoidance behaviors. But then the positive side of Neptune is a spiritual awakening, is an awakening to the side of self that says, I am connected to source consciousness, and therefore I have within me the resources that I need to deal with any of these types of situations that I've outlined. I can deal with a difficult relationship with my mother if I'm a son. I can deal with a difficult relationship with my father if I'm a daughter. I can deal with a difficult boss, or I can deal with a difficult partner. So all of that comes together at this new moon.
Oh gosh, the shadow side of every planet is, I mean, we have all these energies in us, and that's what I find so interesting when people are like, "Oh, but I'm definitely a Libra," when actually they're a Virgo, but we still carry that Libra energy in us anyway. You know, whether you're Sun, Moon, or Saturn, you know, these bigger planets have such a effect on every aspect of our lives. So this trine, the T-square, I think you summed it up beautifully, that we can either sit in denial and not be open to change, but then the world, Uranus, potentially could explode things, make things happen, because we come here with our divine design within us. And we'll get subtle nudges, maybe 2, maybe 3, and then all of a sudden the door will just slam in our face and we go, oh yeah, maybe I should have made that change. So if you are intrigued to see where your Saturn sits in your chart, whether it is in a 10th house as well, or where your ascending sign sits, such important things can be found in your chart. You can hook us up for some of your personal data, either just a chart or a natal reading with us. You'll find all our videos on YouTube, and you can find our podcast on Spotify, Audible, and all the others. So let us know in the comments what you found most intriguing about this conversation, and we shall see you next time. Ngā mihi.
Namaste.